So I'll introduce the speakers one at a time as they speak. And our first speaker, very pleased to introduce, is Councillor Judith Blake, who is the leader of Leeds City Council. Judith, over to you.
Thank you so much, and welcome to everyone on the call. I'm very pleased to be here today, and also very pleased to reflect on the fact that the 5 pillars in the report, Leeds is working on a sort of process of 3 pillars. So really pleased that we're chiming in our approach to this really important issue. We've always talked about Leeds as being a resilient city, and by that, historically, we've meant that we have never focused on just one main industry. And looking across the north in particular, some of the real issues that have come from the centres have been possibly with hindsight and over-resilience on just one sector. Leeds has always been known as a finishing trade city. So going back over the recessions of the last century, for example, we've been able to be possibly more flexible than other cities in our response to some of the shocks that have come our way. But one of the main themes, I think, running through all of the work we're doing at the moment really goes back to that fundamental issue about England being the most centralised country in Europe, if not beyond, and how we actually move forward to have more control over our own destiny. And I think the COVID crisis has really brought that into sharp relief in terms of us coming together across the city region, or now in our case the West Yorkshire region, anticipating a mayoral election next year, but really looking at how we are responding collectively to all of the issues that the COVID crisis has brought our way. But as I say, just a bit of background, Leeds City region is the largest region outside of London and has the largest manufacturing employment base, something that isn't always recognised. It is Britain's second busiest city for legal work and the 3rd for financial services, and our digital sector is growing faster than anywhere in the UK, employing around 30,000 people, an increase of 67% since 2015. We're beginning to have a real reputation for our creative and digital industries, such as Channel 4, as you will all be aware, choosing Leeds for its second base outside of London. But everything now, I think, has been thrown up in the air, and I think today probably will be as much about posing the questions about how we move forward, hopefully into a post-COVID situation, and how we can use this period at the moment to position ourselves to be able to cope with the new reality, and not being clear whether the impact of working from home, for example, is going to be permanent, what that is going to mean for city centres like Leeds, and a real sense of I was going to say foreboding, but just really recognising that the challenges that are being thrown up are immense. So going back to our 3 pillars and how we are tackling the issue of resilience is that all of our policy is going around the 3 pillars from a Leeds perspective of tackling climate emergency, working on a growth scenario, but absolutely rooted in inclusive growth, and the final pillar, our health and wellbeing strategy. And just to reaffirm that this was actually in place before the COVID crisis hit. So we're working around those 3 pillars, and I have to say they are an absolutely a real bedrock for what we're having to deal with as the crisis unfolds. And I think the Marmot Review, which is 10 years old, I have to say, which is quite staggering, absolutely reaffirms everything that we've seen through the pandemic. So an increase in the north-south health gap, the real impact of the virus in areas of high deprivation, for example. But I think what I'd like to finish on as a means of introduction is that I think this crisis has taught us more than anything that we have to build all of our policies and our means of going forward around people. And too many times we have policy decisions that are made that don't actually reference the impact that they're going to have on people, the benefit that they're going to bring, and also an assessment of behaviour and what will drive people forward in certain ways. And transport, I have to say, is one of the worst in this field. So we talk a lot about speed and about routes and about track and about shiny new trains, all very exciting things, but not enough, in my view, in terms of the future transport needs of our population. So these are the aspects that we're focusing on, and of course the economy is absolutely central to how we move forward. So many questions to answer, but I'll leave it there, Adam, and look forward to the discussion as we move forward.
Thank you very much, Judith. Can I just one question which occurs to me, which I'd just love an answer to. I mean, we know that councils obviously were absolutely at the forefront and still are of the fight against the pandemic. One thing which came out really clearly particularly during lockdown, was how willing individual people and communities and groups were to step up to support and help and volunteer. And it seems to me that's got to be the fundamental part of resilient society, is communities willing to do their bit. Do you get a sense that that is something that could be a permanent feature in your experience in Leeds? Is that waning? Are there actual practical things that you're doing to try and maintain that sort of community spirit that supports resilience?
Yeah, I think that there are different levels in that question and comment, actually. And one of the most frustrating things for me through the pandemic so far is that government hasn't been working closely enough with local authorities. And we have so often repeated the message that the response needs to be at a local level, offering our expertise, whether it's in public health, environmental health, all of those things that we can do on the ground. And the reason that we can do them is because local authorities are rooted in their communities. We're very fortunate in Leeds that, I think, because of recognising for many, many years now that we have to be resilient, we won't be eligible for the larger pots of money available through structural funding, for example. We have incredibly strong partnerships on the ground, and those go right across the strategic level with our partner organisations and partner agencies, right down into our communities. And it's that incredible network of strength, I think, that serves us so well. The response to when we recognised that the NHS shielding programme wasn't going to work quickly enough, we set up our own, and the response across the city was absolutely phenomenal. And it is that spirit and that recognition of coming together and supporting the most vulnerable across our communities that I believe will stand us in good stead. And what we have to make sure as we go forward is that we don't allow messages of division to come in. And that has been quite a challenge. but we will keep going on that spirit. And I really do believe it's that local dimension that really comes through, and the public health message that comes to the fore, and that really trusting us to do the work around testing, tracing, supporting people to self-isolate, not punishing them. It is an incredibly challenging area to ask people who are really on the edge, and financially often, to do something that can put their financial stability at risk. So it's that really shifting the dial to giving support that I believe is best done at a local level. So very strong message from us, from local government. We're here and we want to really step up to the plate, but we need to have the resource and the tools to be able to do that.
Thank you very much indeed. I can see people are already putting lots of thoughts in the chat. Please continue to do that. It's great to see that there, and confirms what I said earlier about the incredible calibre of everyone on this call. Also, if you've got a question for the speakers, do feel free to put that in now. Don't feel obliged to wait until the end of the whole panel speaking. I will pick those up as we go along. I'm very pleased to introduce our second speaker, who's Joe Gideon, and the MP for Stoke-on-Trent Central. Joe, take it away.
Thank you very much, Adam. I'm really pleased to be a part of this debate, because social capital and social infrastructure and how we build on that is, to my mind, one of the key aspects of levelling up. In recent months, we've talked a lot about making hard choices, about difficult decisions for our government balancing lives and livelihoods. And I think this pandemic has shown that no government can provide certainty, guarantee safety, or deliver perfect solutions. I do think it's a bit simplistic to compare numerical analysis of how the UK's tackled COVID-19 compared with other countries, because I don't think that takes into account many of the contributory factors, you know, the timeline for the initial spread of the virus, population distribution in different populations, and cultural factors, and also the level of compliance to rules, which is different in different societies. But I do think that this public health emergency and the economic impact of the pandemic has forced us to question the fundamental building blocks of our society. I think we ask ourselves, is it reasonable to look to government agencies to solve every challenge, or pursue a model of investment that sees building resilience as meaning just investing in physical infrastructure and extra services? I believe if we don't grow our social infrastructure, we weaken the resilience of neighbourhoods to support each other. We create expectations that quite frankly, no government, no agency or service provider can fully satisfy. And at the same time, we tell our communities that the ownership of solving local challenges lies with paid service providers. I think that removes the power, from the communities as citizens, which I think is vital. We've got to recognise that there is an economic imperative that needs addressing as part of levelling up. Today, the UK is the most imbalanced country in the industrialised world. Before income tax and benefits, London is 70%, income is 70% higher in London than the rest of the UK. And that's up from 30% in 1997. In a small regional analysis, my constituency in Stoke-on-Trent was the 11th lowest income per head in the UK, going back a couple of years, and also low in income growth, despite productivity growing. So I do keep pressing for investment in better jobs and in attracting ready projects, such as the Advanced Ceramic Campus, which I hope to attract to Stoke. But you know, that's really important. But I think it's really evident to anybody who comes to Stoke-on-Trent that there's a palpable love of the city by local people, and that's despite all the challenges we face. The sense of place and belonging really binds local communities. And I think the other side of that, though, is that there's a sort of stoicism which has led to an acceptance of the status quo, or that sense of, well, it was always like this, and so, you know, being left behind is kind of what we're used to. Civic pride, I think, is an essential part of levelling up, because the feeling that Stoke is on the up motivates more people in the community to take an active part. And I've been pushing that message wherever I can. One example here in Stoke is that we've got a fabulous canal network. And I back the Canal and River Trust with their volunteers, because, you know, volunteering is great, and that's something that's really gone up over COVID. And as part of Civic Pride, I've been pushing for more funding from government to remediate brownfield sites, because I want to change the perception of parts of our city as post-industrial wasteland, because that's a visible reminder of our sort of left behind status. I think we need a new confidence in a new vision for the future, with opportunities for the next generation. And in Stoke, the next generation won't be miners or steel workers, and many of them won't be potters, but they need to develop skills that will work in the newer industries, such as digital, energy and advanced manufacturing. And I support significant investment in social capital based on effectiveness rather than efficiency, on citizens rather than consumers, and on community capacity rather than service provision. I think we need a hybrid model of community support, which incorporates government funding, philanthropic donations and volunteer engagement. It's worked incredibly effectively during lockdown, but to sustain that sort of collaborative working model once we come out of the pandemic, we need to recalibrate our entire support mechanisms to make them more sustainable. I think we need to revisit funding models which favour areas with more bid writing capacity, and models which set up local groups in competition with their neighbours to access limited funds. I don't think is helpful either. So levelling up is not just about catching up with other parts of the country, it's about aiming high. And here, I mean, the North Staff's YMCA, who won an award for the best YMCA in the country, instill a culture that everybody has a talent and everybody deserves help and support to achieve, you know, as much as they can. During this pandemic, we've confronted the unknown, and we've stepped up as a nation, demonstrating the compassionate society that we are, full of innovators and heroes. And in a recent survey I conducted, the majority of people had a positive lockdown experience, talking about feeling closer to their community, and 100% of people who volunteered for the first time during lockdown said they would do so again. Somehow we've got to build on these local networks to make this possible. I think now is the time to look at what changes we could make to the structure of civil society and redesign our systems to fit a post-COVID world. The power to keep safe, healthy, enterprising, to provide care and look after our planet starts in our own backyard. From neighbourhood watch to litter picks and food banks, from collecting a neighbour's prescription to coordinating home deliveries to elderly neighbours during lockdown, we've all become really aware of how interdependent we really are, of our vulnerability and also of the power of community. I think that the culture of measuring and monitoring, of managing people through systems, passing them from one service to another, and funding services through different government departments does not provide the best outcomes for the community. This manages dependence, and instead I think we need to give power back to local communities to support their locally defined priorities. There are some obvious indicators of inequalities of opportunity in health, and Stoke-on-Trent, you know, features high in all the things you want to be low on, and low on all the things you want to be high on. But I don't think we address the root causes of inequality if we look for a kind of global solution. Just as the challenges are local, the solutions have to be local too. And I think we need to involve families, neighbourhoods and a wide range of community organisations which already exist to underpin the actions needed. So this is a time to be brave if we want real change, to find lasting solutions in areas of social inequality. We must be prepared to trust local champions, to grow the capacity of our communities, and accept that some things will work and some things won't. And that's all right, because the learning will help us to develop groundbreaking ideas that do.
Thank you very much. Incredibly thoughtful and interesting contribution there. And it's already stimulating quite a lot of discussion in the chat, which is great, and a few questions coming through there. One very quick question back to you, Jo, which I think for me is really important. I hope for others is as well. I mean, it's incredibly thoughtful. And I just wonder, in your experience in Westminster, is this issue of resilience and the role of the local and communities in building resilience, is it really on people's agendas up there? You sort of see it creeping through. I mean, Danny Kruger wrote about it in his recent report. Rachael Reeves for Labour side has spoken about resilience. But my sense is it's maybe not as high on the agenda as it should be. What's your feelings on that?
Well, so you know, Danny's produced an incredibly powerful piece, and I would say it's on the agenda of a sizable group of the new intake. And I think that the fact that we represent those left behind communities, and we understand what needs to happen, means that we are collectively and individually trying to influence probably the kind of traditional government take on levelling up as being about building roads and physical infrastructure, and saying no, you know, it's got to be more than that. And you know, I think that to a certain extent we're pushing against an open door, in that when we say it, it makes sense. The big challenge is going to be how we get you know, financial support behind it. It's easy to say, you know, if we build this road or get this investment in employment, it'll be X number of jobs. It's much more difficult to quantify the benefits to our society and our economy, because you know, some of the most important social challenges we have are a huge amount of cost to the NHS. You know, so I'm just thinking kind of health inequalities, and I'm the chair of the APPG on the National Food Strategy, and you know, there's a big piece around if we don't make sure that we've got healthy diets, there's a massive cost to the NHS, there's a cost to the economy of people not being able to go to work because they've got long-term health issues. But the evidencing of that is something that we've now got to do. So we need lots of think tanks to do lots of work and to support us on that.
Thank you very much. Well, that was a nice little segue for New Local. We're doing our bit. We're doing our bit. Lots of questions going on in the chat. I am keeping an eye on them, and I will weave them in to the questions once the panel has finished. So do keep those questions coming. Our next speaker is Rachael Orr, and she is the director of PlaceShapers. Rachael.
Thank you, Adam, and thanks very much for inviting me to be part of this really fascinating event this morning. So yeah, I'm the director of PlaceShapers. We are a network of about 120 community-based social landlords. So we've got members who are housing associations and ALMOs based across England. And when people join PlaceShapers, they kind of subscribe to our principles and values, which are very much about putting our residents and communities first, about working in partnership to achieve our aims and our social purpose. And about being really rooted in the places that we work, seeing our role as going far beyond that of a landlord to being kind of a kind of anchor institution in our communities. And what I've seen in the past kind of 6-8 months, sort of lose track, is a huge amount of resilience at a sort of individual, local and community level. We ran a number of round tables for our members about 4 or 5 weeks into lockdown, and as well as being a space for them all to kind of, I think, let off all the various challenges that had been thrown at them, what they were really keen to do was just express how adaptable and resilient staff, wider communities, residents had been in the face of kind of responding to lockdown and the pandemic. Most housing associations started phoning up their residents, starting with those that they knew to be the most vulnerable, and just asking them if they needed any help and support. And there's you know, fantastic stories from across social landlords, but there's one kind of statistic that really, for me, stands out in terms of highlighting that resilience. So Carbon Homes are a big social landlord in the northeast of England. They have about 10,000 homes. So they phoned all of their residents, which is just an amazing effort by their staff, you know, kind of staff right across the business were on the phone speaking to residents. And they asked all of them, do you need some help? Do you need some support? And only 400 people said, we need help from you. Everyone else that needed support was getting it from their local community, from their neighbours, from family who were able to drop stuff at the door and kind of maintain social distance. So they were all delighted to have heard from their housing association. It made them feel really kind of connected to them. But actually, the local community had more than risen to the challenge in terms of providing that support to people. I think what I also saw was housing associations being able to support that community effort, probably in ways that we haven't always done. So I think some housing associations have been guilty in the past of saying, well, if there's a problem in my community, we are going to fix it. That's always incredibly well-meaning, but it's not always the answer. And actually what I saw across the country was housing associations saying, we have a role to play in this place. What's the best role that we can play? For example, a North Star Housing Association, again, based up in the northeast of England, and they have quite a lot of properties in small rural areas. And they were getting in touch with residents and saying, what do you need? And in a couple of villages, the residents said, well, actually, the most important lifeline for us is our local shop and post office, but we're worried that's going to close. So North Star have been funding 2 local post offices so that they could stay open, because that was the best possible service they could provide to the residents and communities in those places, and to support that resilience. And I think that kind of innovative thinking, that genuine working in partnership and being really willing to do what's needed, that's what I saw from individuals and from organisations working at that kind of local neighbourhood level. And really, it was really inspiring. I think where you see the scale of that resilience is if you're in the kind of privileged position that I am, where you get to hear these stories from kind of all over the country. But I think what we would mainly have felt ourselves is that kind of resilience and that response to what was happening on a very, very local level in our immediate streets and our immediate neighbourhoods. So what does that mean for the future? Because what I found so fascinating about reading your report on resilience was those really big, challenging questions for the future. And I definitely don't have all the answers, but I do have a few thoughts. So one is, I think that when we think about the challenges that are coming at us, I think housing associations have a huge role to play in helping us to try and overcome some of those challenges. So if we think about the climate challenge, getting to net zero carbon, one of the biggest emitters of carbon is our homes. There's a huge role for housing associations in terms of upgrading properties, but also working with communities in terms of that conversation. There's a huge job creation role that housing associations can play a part in. So I think we need to think about how we can be more involved, not just at a very local level, but in those more strategic conversations in places. And that's why it's so great to be at this event today and speaking with other people who are kind of involved in those discussions. I think we need to think about leadership. You know, as both the other speakers have kind of mentioned, of course we can look to central government, and sometimes that's fantastic and sometimes that's frustrating. But actually we also need to think about who are the leaders locally and what more can we do to support them, whether they're leaders of organisations, whether they're leaders of communities, whether they're people who don't know they're leaders yet, but they need some support and help to kind of drive things forward. So I think there's a role for us in supporting organisations and individuals in terms of that leadership. But I do think we need to be making the point over and over again that there are fantastic people working in these local places, and they do need more opportunity to deliver some things locally. I was at an event this morning where we were talking about employment support. Housing associations are the second biggest providers of employment support programmes after the Department for Work and Pensions. And one of the big findings from our report was that actually, if you devolved quite a lot of the funding locally, local providers could adapt much better to local job markets and deliver more responsive programmes. And finally, I think we need to keep thinking about how we can join up people and services in places. I think that can happen and has happened potentially in the kind of response to the pandemic, when we've all had this common goal. It's been really clear what we've been trying to achieve. but how do we kind of cement those partnerships and those ways of working moving forwards? I don't think anyone's cracked that yet, but I think this is absolutely the right time to be thinking about how we do that, so we can continue to transform from that kind of individual resilience that we've seen into something at a much kind of bigger and more structural level.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Really, really interesting. Great examples of stuff that's really happening on the ground in your particular sector. Really good to hear that. I've got questions I'm going to come back to you on, I'm sure, because there's questions in the chat, but I want to get through all of the speakers so that we can have time for some of the questions, Q&A as well. So our next speaker is Josie Warden. She's the Associate Director of the Design and Innovation team at my old employer, the Royal Society for the Arts. Josie.
Thanks very much. I think, Adam, we crossed over by about a day several years ago. Thank you so much for having me and being part of this really interesting discussion. I think it's absolutely, as other speakers have said, a really critical time to be talking about this. So I think I want to pick up on a couple of things that I thought were really, really interesting in the report. And the first one is around really unpicking what we really mean by resilience. I think, as you say, it's kind of not about bouncing back to business as usual or trying to shore up systems or processes which are not working and sort of doggedly sticking to the same path that we've been trying to forge for a while, but actually really thinking about how we can reconceptualize what it means to work with the kind of complex systems that we've got in our world at the moment. And these are living and dynamic and changing all the time. And as we've definitely seen through COVID, and as we're seeing through climate change, that we can't necessarily, or we're not able to really understand how these might ripple through society. They're unpredictable and non-linear in the way that they affect what we're doing. So when we come to think about resilience, it's really important that we think about resilience not being about sort of standing firm and resisting impacts and saying doggedly in one place, but thinking about it as a case of evolution and kind of adaptation to the way things are happening around us. I think we're seeing, it feels like it's a really interesting time that we're in now, because there are these conversations about what does resilience mean. There's lots of conversations about regeneration, and this emerging idea of kind of being adaptable to the things that are coming through. And I think in this, it's really important that we are learning from the natural world that we're part of. The ecosystems that are in the world are not static and unmoving, but they're constantly changing and constantly adapting. And we need to be thinking about how we can move in those kinds of mindsets as well. And it requires a different kinds of approaches than we've been seeing, and we're maybe more used to when we're dealing with things that are more complicated or mechanistic issues where you're able to kind of centrally decide something and roll it out. Actually, we need to be able to be much more adaptive and evolve to what's been happening. So I think that kind of keeping coming back to what we really mean by resilience is going to be crucial if we're going to get onto the kind of right path in these different approaches. And I think the other thing I wanted to pick up from the report is around thinking about the 5 pillars, and the focus on environment as one of the pillars. And this is definitely something which is said in the report, but really kind of understanding that the environment is not necessarily the same as some of those other pillars, but it's absolutely foundational to everything that we do as a society. And I don't think we've really fully absorbed that and what that means, and how that kind of, we can see that sort of disconnect playing out in the way we try and address climate, or conversations around sort of energy or soil depletion or degradation and inequality, and actually seeing that we quite often think about them as very separate things that we can deal with in silos, and actually seeing them as foundational to everything that we're doing is really critical. And I think even within the economy, we've recognised that, and I think other couple of speakers have picked up on this around some of the things that we've not recognised as being key or foundational, whether that's the environment or whether that's key workers, have become much more visible this year. And I think really recognising that that is something that we need to pay attention to is essential. And we're already seeing the kind of impact of those changes around us, both in the UK on environment, but around the world with the kind of fires in California, etc. And I think recognising that kind of being resilient, we cannot do that if we're not resilient within the kind of natural ecosystems that are around us. And it's been interesting as well seeing how different cultures around the world are aware of this and are bringing that into their models of thinking, whether it's kind of the kind of Maori ways of thinking in investment in New Zealand, or the work that's happening in the US, again, around Indigenous communities, and thinking about actually the relationship that we have with our world and how that affects society, and then therefore how that affects economy is really interesting. And then in the UK, the kind of models around donor economics, the work of Kate Rayworth, etc., are kind of really, again, trying to reframe that model. And I think that conversation is so central, because if we don't really recognise where that resilience is coming from us as a society, then I think we're going to be kind of fighting a losing battle to kind of pick off the other things individually. So I think in terms of how we go about moving forward in this space, I think a lot of the stuff that fellow speakers have picked up on is really where we're interested in as well, and that's kind of thinking about what are those things that are really foundational to our lives, and how can we pay more attention to them. And a lot of that is to do with the relationships that are between things, which has come out a lot today already. The kind of maybe the work or the connections that have been less visible or less paid attention to between communities, between individuals, are really central to this. And the importance of leadership creating enabling conditions for responses to emerge from people who have the knowledge and have the experience in those local places. And often that is to do with location, it's different kinds of knowledge, so whether that might be kind of lived experience or an experience of working in a particular place. That kind of knowledge is really essential to helping to find these solutions moving forward. So for leaders to kind of create those enabling conditions is really important, and we've had some really good examples of that already today. And I think another important part of that is the kind of idea of experimentation, that we're not able to kind of plan and roll out what these things are happening, but finding small pockets of innovation. I think from what Rachael was saying just now around how housing associations have taken this as an opportunity to kind of do something different. And I think we've seen that across so many different things this year, where people have maybe taken an experimental approach that would not have felt like the right thing to do in normal conditions, has actually led to some really interesting pockets of innovation. And I think that example of the post office is such a great space of being an enabler for people to find the right solutions for them, which I think is really exciting. And then, finally, just ensuring that those different perspectives and different ways of knowing are really being heard in communities. I think we've seen some interesting examples from a national level with things like the Climate Assembly, but actually the kind of everyday practices of how people can be involved in shaping discussions are really important. And some of the work that the RSA has been doing with our fellows is thinking about how do we make sense of the change that's been happening around us, and like running spaces to host conversations about actually looking back and looking forward. Where do we want to go from here? What are the experiences we've had? How can we harness some of those? What things do we want to keep and try and embed into practice, whether that's the kind of volunteering side or the kind of community cohesion that we've seen around things, or whether it's actually letting go of some things. Maybe that's thinking about how we travel differently, or changing the way that we are consuming, etc. I think all of those things are really important to kind of create those spaces for those kinds of conversations. So I just think it's a really exciting time for this, and I think bringing in the conversations about not just resilience for us as a society, but also resilience for future generations. And we've seen in Wales the really interesting work around the Future Generations Act, and similarly in New Zealand, thinking about like changing the scales that we see resilience at, and thinking about that foundational work and thinking about the long term as well. I feel like it's just a very, very exciting time to be talking about this.
Thank you very much, Josie. Thanks to all our speakers. There are definite themes, I think, emerging in the chat, and I'd just like to pick up on two of those. The first one, which seems to be coming through very strongly, is this issue of trust and how important trust is to building resilience. And I think what people mean by that is trust within communities, how much we trust each other as citizens and are willing to work together. But I think also the trust that we have in our decision makers and the decisions they take, which we can see, particularly during a pandemic, has been absolutely vital and maybe has fallen apart. And we could look at something like the States, maybe, where it really has cracked very, very badly. But obviously there's real tensions here as well. So just a question really to Judith first. What role do you think local governments, councils, maybe the broader public sector has in building trust within communities and ensuring that citizens actually have trust in public decision makers themselves? Have we done enough to really do that, do you think?
I'm sure it's patchy, but where we have examples of where it's happened, I think the benefits are just so obvious. I always say to people in the communities I represent, if you have an honest relationship, you go out and explain some of the difficult decisions that you have to make, very often when you go into that level of detail and talk everyone through it, the response is, well, we realize we don't like it, but we understand now why it has to happen. And I don't think there is enough of that real grassroots engagement happening. And I think the more that we can do that, and then all of the issues around a place-based model in terms of co-production, making sure that it doesn't appear that there's one dominant voice that is imposing their will all the time, but things are done with that spirit of collaboration and fairness that really is so important. It's a time-intensive process, but once you start to get those relationships built and that trust developing, then you start to get the levels of disclosure, for example. So where you're talking in an environment of antisocial behaviour or real risk to the security in a particular community, where the local police have been able to develop a really strong neighbourhood led model, then that just pays back in volumes in terms of really being able to anticipate where problems are developing and not waiting for things to have escalated to a situation that then becomes very difficult to control.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And Joe, I just wonder, in your role as an MP, do you have time to consider what your role might be in fostering trust? Because, I mean, clearly we know that for a long time now there's been declining trust in democratic decision-making, in government. I mean, that's not a problem just for this government. That's been going on for potentially decades now. Is there a role for the MP in terms of building a different type of relationship that is more about trust, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's the key role of an MP, to my mind. I think Rachael mentioned leadership, and if I can do anything as an MP, it is to be a sort of catalyst for change by bringing together all those voices and all those people that have the solutions. When I first became an MP, somebody said, well, what are you going to do to level up? And I said, well, the first thing I'm going to do is to talk to all those people in the local community who know so much better than me what's needed, and you know, and gather a collection of knowledge rather than try and second guess what a solution might look like. And I think that's the key message, that for any member of parliament, you know, it is absolutely about understanding your local community and the leaders within that community. And as somebody said, it doesn't matter where they come from. There needs to be a balance, so it doesn't need to be dominated by people whose job it is to deliver certain things, but you know, a shared sense of ownership of what the solutions are.
And that's very, very interesting to hear. It's brilliant to hear. Just one quick follow-up question that occurs to me. I mean, we do rather like starving our elected representatives of resources in this country. And I wonder if MPs are genuinely going to play that sort of consensus building role, which I think is fantastic to hear. It's something that, you know, I've long believed in and we've promoted at New Local. Do you need more resource, more funds? Because that can be quite an expensive thing to do, to sort of genuinely consensus build.
Trust me, I'm always asking for it.
Yeah, of course.
But yes, so I mean, clearly consensus building and delivering certain things has a financial aspect to it, but it has more than that. And I think, you know, when you're talking about a community that feels that it's been left behind for decades, the solution doesn't come overnight. And I think that to be honest and to be realistic and to say, you know, when people say to me, well, you know, you've been in office now since December, never mind the pandemic, you know, we haven't leveled up yet. I say, well, you know, let's just be realistic about this. But we do need to develop a kind of pathway, if you like. And once we've got that, so I'm at the stage of information gathering and people gathering and creating that collective ask, and in the meantime, you know, I continue to ask for things, just because if you don't ask, you don't get in government.
Thank you very much. I just want to move on to the other theme which emerged from the chat, which is about shifting of values. And I think this has come through from all the speakers as well, but it's coming through in the chat that you know, to become more resilient, maybe we need to move our value set away from the sort of harder measures of GDP growth, financial well-being, personal accumulation, more to something that's about community, about social support, about working together. And I wonder, Josie, starting with you, and you talked a lot about this as well, that feels to me like a really big shift to make. And I think people sometimes underestimate how, you know, the incentives built around the way that we live and the way that we work now are incredibly strong. Where do you start in terms of making that shift? Does it have to happen from the top down in the way national politicians speak, or has it something that's built up from the grassroots, or both potentially?
That's, yeah, really good question. I think it is huge. I think some of the things that we've been thinking about a lot are, it really is those kind of very, very deep mindsets that we have around how we think things work, that have kind of, we've then built structures around that, and then we measure things around that, and actually realising that some of those assumptions weren't quite right, and we need to be shifting those is a really deep challenge. And I think it has to happen at all levels, which is, you know, quite an easy thing to say, but it also has to happen, I think it has to happen at all levels of, as in from like government down to community grassroots. And I think that there's amazing practice already out there. There's lots of stuff that's happening and people who are thinking and changing ways already. And a lot of the, I think what you touched on just then about trust is also about allowing some of that to flourish and to provide resources. And someone else talked previously about funding, maybe resources that also allows that to kind of connect up and to be a kind of field of practice rather than individual pockets. I think that's often the thing that can be tricky to kind of shift the system if lots of small things are happening and they're not necessarily kind of talking to one another or learning from one another. But I think it's also change that has to happen from different levels in terms of like yourself as well, and all of us seeing ourselves as part of what is happening, and the way that we show up at work, or the way that we communicate and connect with people, the way that we think about things, all of that has an impact on what we're doing. So it's also kind of different levels from internal to external as well around reflecting on that. And that's, again, a really hard thing to ask people to do, and especially when there's so much happening and there's so much intensity around, particularly this year, providing the space for that to happen is very difficult. But I think this year has also been a catalyst for that, and we've seen people reflecting on, like, actually, what is my relationship with my job and what I get from it and what it kind of gives to my life, or what is my relationship with the environment around me, or the things that are important in my life when I'm not seeing friends and family, etc. So I think some of that sort of internal stuff has also started, and I think finding ways to allow people to explore that is also really important. So I think that's a bit of it's kind of at all levels, and in all levels, internally and externally as well.
Thank you very much. Although I see that Dawn Dublin has said the top-down approach has failed again and again in the chat. So maybe it does need to come up as much from the grassroots as possible. Rachael, just picking up on that point. I mean, it seems to me that your membership is a sort of interesting case study in this, in a way, because social landlords, they're there for a social purpose, but they're also at the same time, of course, they have a bottom line, they have to generate margin, they have to survive financially in, you know, in a pretty tough sector, really, the property sector. So I wondered, to what extent do you think you can straddle both those different value sets and remain resilient? And do you notice that in the sector you work in yourself, that maybe there is a shift occurring more towards being more value-led, more about resilience and community, less about money, and sort of not being too concerned about however anyone else fares?
I think that you can, we shouldn't always set these two things up as a kind of in competition. You can be values led and also display some kind of sound business acumen. And I think that's what I would say our members want to do. They want to get the best possible deals. They want to be able to borrow at the most favourable rates so they can build the biggest number of homes that people in their communities can afford, and then do the other things that they can do to help support their communities. So I don't think it's helpful if we kind of set those up as kind of competing. I do think that the last 6 months or so have made social landlords consider again their social purpose. And actually, what I'm finding really interesting is that that's expanding. It's not just, you know, have we been doing the right thing in terms of the homes that we've been building? Actually, people are saying now, have we been building the right homes? But they're also saying, actually, what is our bigger role in these places? I think a lot of our members were saying that anyway, but they're saying it even more now. You know, this is going to be a really difficult next couple of years. We know that, you know, our members work in quite a lot of, you know, the poorest parts of the country. We're all going to need to pull together to make sure people don't really, you know, have a really, really tough time. And I think they're seeing the need to respond to that. I would also say, I think there's something quite interesting about housing associations' business model. Actually, they've been pretty resilient so far. I don't think we're kind of out of the woods yet, but actually I think that mix of the kind of having some assets, you know, being able to do the borrowing, but also having that real social purpose has meant that so far we've been able to kind of weather the economic storm better than some others have been able to.
Thank you. No, thank you very much. That's extremely interesting. And just another question, specific question to end on, which has come up in the chat, starting with you, Rachael. The role of digital in all this, that's come up a couple of times in the chat. We've made this very sudden shift to all being online, and it looks like that isn't going to, you know, change anytime soon. What's your sense in how that might help with resilience? Does it help people connect, start building resilience, work in more productive ways? Or is there a risk that we are actually excluding a whole range of people, maybe sometimes the poorest people, who maybe don't have access to digital, who actually really need to be included in thinking about becoming more resilient?
I think it has the potential to do the former, but I think our members' feedback would be that actually we've seen the kind of real digital divide since lockdown started, and not just the kind of have older people struggled and younger people haven't. Actually, the biggest divide we find is accessibility to the hardware, sometimes the internet connection. But what our members have said most is that they've set up hardship funds and they've been buying laptops and tablets for people, because you can't homeschool your kids if they haven't got anything to do their schoolwork on. I think there's something really interesting for housing associations if we're providing extra care, if we're providing sheltered housing schemes and extra care schemes. Is it really viable in the future to not think of broadband as an essential service in those kind of settings? And I think that's something that a lot of people are thinking about. But I think the first thing we need to do in order to think about the opportunities of digital is that make sure more people have got access to it. And if people can't have that in their own homes, we need to be thinking about the community spaces where that's freely accessible and available to people.
And thank you very much. And just final points to Joe and Judith then. What's been your experience? Has the shift to online connection, digital, has that helped you build the relationships of trust, maybe reach into parts of the community you might not normally be able to reach, or has it been a bit of a barrier? Start with you, Joe. What's been your experience?
I mean, so my experience is that there has been digital exclusion, but the hardest to reach in Stoke, and we mentioned homeschooling, and that's an obvious one where people who were already behind, you know, have become farther behind. Obviously, on Zoom, we tend to talk to a lot of decision makers and strategic conversations rather than reaching out to those parts of the community that we would normally meet in simpler times. But I do think, and I think it's a really important point, that just as we all expect to have electricity and gas and water in our homes, broadband is an absolute must, and it has shown us over this time, whether it was connectivity or hardware, we absolutely have to bring up the digital infrastructure in this country for everybody.
Thank you very much. And then finally to you, Judith, what's been the council's experience of digital, a helper or a hindrance in terms of building those connections?
So one of the first things we did when we realised we were going to go into lockdown, we managed to get ahead of the curve and moved 10,000, the capacity for 10,000 of our staff to be able to work remotely, which was an incredible achievement and something that I don't think we'd ever realised was possible. And I think it's that working through it and recognising the benefits of being able to use the technology that's available, but certainly in terms of digital exclusion, it has highlighted so many of the issues that we've been talking about before. But I just would stress that I believe that broadband should be a service. I think all new homes should make sure they're connected, but it's reaching out to the people that haven't got that ability. It's not just about hardware though. And the idea that you can provide kids, for example, with all of the hardware and that will solve the problems of remote learning is incredibly simplistic and needs to be treated with extreme care. But we have found some real spin-offs as well. So working with some, young people, for example, who have really struggled in terms of being in educational establishments for whatever reason. Many of them have actually really thrived with the intensive support, the one-to-one relationships, and actually recognizing why it is that they haven't engaged in education, and too often it is because of the physical presence that's been required of them. So we need to make sure that we keep a really open mind and really keep analysing all of the impacts. But again, for young people, they might be the best connected, but if they are, sitting on the edge of their bed, working from home because they haven't got the space to have a table in the place that they're working in, for example, all of those things, I think, it's exposing a far greater divide than just the fact of whether you've got access to the internet and the hardware to deal with it. Real issues that are coming up that we need to be learning from and helping us to plan for the future.
Thank you very much indeed. Excellent points to finish on. We've gone a couple of minutes over, so apologies for that. Let me say thank you very much to all of you for the excellent comments in the chat and the excellent questions. Be aware that Local Trust and ourselves at New Local are going to keep working on this issue. It's such an important issue. It's not something we want to let it drop. But mostly, let me say thank you very much to really our 4 excellent speakers, really inspirational, very, very thoughtful contributions. So thank you very much indeed. I know we don't applaud on Zoom because that's just weird. So I'll just say thanks on behalf of everyone else. And thanks to all of you. Do enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. Bye.